General Hospital spoilers reveal that Elizabeth had always prided herself on her ability to make difficult decisions, to stand firm in the face of moral dilemmas. She had navigated personal heartbreak, family betrayals, and professional challenges, always managing to find her way back to the path of integrity. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when Drew Kane entered her life with a request that would threaten to tear apart everything she believed in. Drew, a man she had once trusted, had come to her, asking her to do something that not only went against her principles but also put her entire future at risk. It began with a simple ask, or at least it seemed that way at first. Drew was desperate to fix things with Willow and find a way to repair the damage done by his affair with Nina. He claimed that altering Michael's psychiatric test results was the only way to make things right, to secure Willow's future and possibly mend the fractured relationship between them. Drew was asking Elizabeth to help him make Michael appear to be struggling with drug addiction, to change the test results and destroy his credibility in the custody battle over Willow's children. The request was chilling, not because of its complexity, but because of its simple yet devastating consequences. Elizabeth was being asked to betray everything she stood for. To undermine someone she considered family for the sake of someone else's twisted need for control. Drew was no longer the man she once knew. His desperation had turned him into something darker. Someone who was willing to sacrifice anyone and anything in order to get what he wanted. As Elizabeth stood there, the weight of his request pressing down on her, she realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about helping Drew or fixing a relationship, it was about compromising her integrity, her entire moral foundation, and becoming an accomplice to something that could ruin lives. The thought of tampering with the test results sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. And the consequences of getting caught would be severe. The truth would come out eventually. And Drew's scheme would not only destroy Michael's future but could also tarnish Elizabeth's reputation beyond repair. She was torn, unable to move, as Drew's words echoed in her mind. She had always been the one to help others, to find solutions to problems. But this time, the solution involved breaking the law, bending the truth to suit Drew's needs. Elizabeth's mind raced. Her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. How could Drew, the man she had once trusted, ask her to do this? How could he believe that changing Michael's test results would somehow fix everything? She knew that tampering with the truth wasn't the answer. She had seen firsthand the damage that lies could do. The way they could spiral out of control and cause irreparable harm. This wasn't just about saving Willow or Michael, it was about saving herself from becoming someone she could no longer recognize. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. But Drew wasn't finished. He wasn't just asking for her help, he was threatening her, using her own secrets to manipulate her into compliance. He knew about Christina and the car accident, knew that Elizabeth had kept quiet about the incident that had nearly destroyed Rick. He knew that Elizabeth had remained silent. Afraid of the consequences if the truth came out, afraid of the damage it could do to Christina's life. Drew saw this as leverage, as a way to force Elizabeth into doing his bidding. If she didn't comply, he would expose her secrets, and everything she had worked so hard to protect would be destroyed. The realization hit Elizabeth like a punch to the gut. She had always prided herself on her honesty, on her ability to stand tall and face the truth, but Drew had turned that very honesty against her. He was using her own fear to control her. To make her comply with his demands. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. She could give in, change the results, and hope that Drew would keep his word and not expose her secrets. But deep down, she knew that was a dangerous game to play. Drew was ruthless, and once he had what he wanted, he would turn on her, just as he had done with so many others. The other option was to refuse him. To stand up to his threats and take the consequences, whatever they might be. She could go to the police, confess her silence about Christina's involvement in the accident, and face the repercussions. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way she could live with herself. The fear of losing everything, her career, her reputation, her relationships, was overwhelming. But the fear of becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone who would betray her own values for the sake of protecting herself, was even greater. Elizabeth knew what she had to do. Even though it terrified her. She couldn't let Drew control her, couldn't let him destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. She would make the choice to do what was right. No matter the cost. Drew's manipulation, his threats, his desperation, they no longer had a hold on her. She would face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Because that was the only way she could retain her sense of self. As she turned away from Drew, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders, she knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles she couldn't yet see, but it was the only road she could take. Drew had made his move. But Elizabeth was no longer the pawn in his game. She was taking control of her own fate, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her own power. Her ability to choose the right path, even when it was the hardest one to walk. The storm was far from over, and there were more battles to be fought, more secrets to be uncovered. But Elizabeth was ready. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the truth was the only thing that would set her free. Drew's desperation was taking a darker turn as he found himself consumed by the need to control Michael. His obsession with Michael's future had crossed a line. And his relentless efforts to manipulate every situation to his advantage were beginning to feel more like a dangerous game. Drew had come to realize that the only way to secure his own position in Willow's life was to ensure that Michael was out of the picture, and he wasn't afraid to use any means necessary to do so. But his actions weren't confined to Michael alone. Willow, too, was caught in the web of manipulation, unable to escape the shadows that Drew was casting over her. Her emotional state had been pushed to the breaking point, and her need to protect her family led her to make choices she never thought she would. Willow, having already suffered so much, was now turning on those closest to her. She had found herself in an almost unrecognizable position as she was forced to take drastic action. Her growing paranoia had driven her to take control of the situation in the only way she could. Daisy, who had once been a trusted ally, found herself on the receiving end of Willow's fury. The tension between them reached its breaking point when Willow, feeling cornered, made the ultimate decision to push Daisy and Sasha out of Port Charles entirely. It was a move that shocked everyone, including herself, but Willow was driven by a need to secure control, to maintain some semblance of order in a world that was increasingly slipping away from her. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Drew's scheming were starting to unravel Michael in ways that no one could have predicted. The darkness surrounding him was growing. And it wasn't just about the custody battle or his strained relationship with Willow. Michael was becoming someone else entirely. His desperate need to protect his family, his obsession with reclaiming what he felt was rightfully his, was starting to change him in ways that even he didn't fully understand. The man he once was, idealistic, compassionate, driven by a sense of justice, was now slowly being replaced by a darker, more calculating version of himself. As Drew's influence crept deeper into Michael's life, the cracks in his once strong moral foundation began to widen. The decisions Michael was making no longer seemed driven by love or fairness, but by a thirst for control, for power, for dominance over a situation that had spiraled out of his control. The changes happening in Michael's life were far from subtle. His actions, once thoughtful and considered, now appeared rash, desperate. He had begun to cut ties with those who didn't align with his vision, pushing away allies in favor of people who could help him secure his goals. This wasn't just a battle for his family. It was a battle for his soul, and the longer he fought, the more he risked losing the person he once was. The shift in his character was becoming unmistakable. And it was clear that the path he was walking was leading him into darkness. No longer guided by his former sense of morality, Michael was becoming a shadow of the man he used to be. And no one seemed able to stop the downward spiral. The web of manipulation that Drew had spun was no longer just about the people in his immediate circle, it was about everyone, about everything. And it was starting to affect the very fabric of Port Charles itself. As the stakes rose, the consequences of these twisted games grew more severe. The once clear boundaries between right and wrong were becoming blurred, and everyone was left wondering how far they would go to protect themselves and the ones they loved. Drew's relentless pursuit of control, combined with the growing darkness in Michael, was setting the stage for a new kind of chaos, one that no one in Port Charles would be able to escape unscathed. And as the people closest to him made choices they never thought they would. The true cost of Drew's influence, and the dark transformation of Michael, was beginning to reveal itself in ways that were both shocking and devastating. The changes were undeniable. The manipulations were working, but at what cost? No one could say for sure how far the damage would go, but one thing was clear: Drew and Michael were changing the very landscape of Port Charles. And the ripple effects of their actions were going to be felt for a long time. The shifts in Elizabeth and Willow's worlds had become more than just subtle changes. They had become an undeniable force, pushing them both to the edge of what they could endure. The new adjustments in their lives, adjustments they hadn't chosen but were forced into, had caused their once steady foundations to crack. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that they were no longer willing to stand by idly and allow the forces around them to control their destinies. They were ready for change. And this change was not going to be quiet or passive. Elizabeth, who had long been the rock for others, was beginning to feel the weight of her own actions, the consequences of her silence. And the manipulation Drew had woven into the fabric of their lives. She had been pushed into a corner, forced to confront a truth that she had been avoiding for so long. Drew's blackmail, his manipulation of the people around him, had gone too far. Elizabeth knew that if she didn't act soon, if she didn't take control, she would lose herself to the darkness Drew was intent on creating. The woman who had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost, was now caught in a web of lies and threats that made her feel trapped, her every move watched. But this was the breaking point. Elizabeth could no longer ignore the weight of Drew's actions on her life, and she knew she wasn't alone in her fury. Willow, too, was realizing just how far they had all fallen, how deeply they had allowed Drew to manipulate their lives. Willow, once so gentle and kind, had been pushed to the brink by Drew's relentless actions. Her trust in those around her, especially in Michael, had been tested to the core. The betrayal she felt, not only from Drew but from the people she loved, was turning her into someone unrecognizable. She had spent so long trying to protect her family, trying to keep the peace, but Drew's interference had forced her to take a hard look at the reality she was living in. The damage he had caused was no longer something she could overlook. She had been pushed beyond the breaking point, and now, like Elizabeth, she was ready to fight back. The new adjustments were nothing short of maddening. Drew's hold over them had been insidious, creeping into their lives in ways they hadn't even noticed until it was too late. The pressure to conform, to keep silent, to play along with his twisted games had stretched them both to their limits. They had been controlled by fear, by threats, by the weight of their secrets. But that was changing. Elizabeth's inner resolve, once shaken, was now solidifying into something more determined. Willow, too, was finding strength in the midst of her anguish. The transformation happening within them both was undeniable. They were no longer willing to be passive players in Drew's game. They were ready to take back their lives, to fight for their freedom. To break free from the chains he had wrapped around them. What was once a distant thought, a fleeting desire for independence, was now becoming a burning necessity. Both Elizabeth and Willow could feel it, the shift in their hearts, the change in their actions. They weren't going to let Drew's manipulation define them anymore. The once strong bonds of loyalty and love were now tempered with the cold reality that they had to take matters into their own hands. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Together, they were becoming a force to be reckoned with. Elizabeth's moral compass, which had always guided her through the storm, was now the sharp edge of a weapon. Willow, once the embodiment of grace under pressure, was finding the courage to stand up and fight for herself, for her children, and for the future she wanted to create. They both understood now that the only way to take back control was to confront Drew head-on. And as the realization set in, they knew it wasn't going to be easy. The battle they were about to wage would be nothing short of fierce, but they were ready. They were both fueled by a newfound rage, a desperation to reclaim their lives. To be free of the shadows Drew had cast over them. Their path was clear. They would confront Drew. They would fight for the freedom they so desperately needed. They would no longer be pawns in his twisted game. The adjustments, the changes that had shaken them to their cores, had given them the strength to do what they had to do, take control. Not just of their futures, but of their identities. They weren't going to be dictated to anymore. The time for standing by had passed. Now was the time for action, for attack, for freedom. Elizabeth had always been someone who placed the well-being of those she cared about above all else. But the new obsession consuming her mind was far different than anything she had experienced before. The stakes were higher now, far more dangerous than ever before. Her desire to safeguard Michael, to ensure his reputation and future remained intact, was driving her into uncharted territory, forcing her to make choices she had never thought possible. Her need to protect Michael had become an all-consuming force. He was no longer just a family member she cared for, he had become the person she was willing to sacrifice everything for. The threat Drew posed to Michael's future was something Elizabeth couldn't ignore, and as she dug deeper into the schemes Drew had set into motion. Not just for Michael, but for herself. She couldn't allow Drew to destroy the people she loved, and she couldn't stand by while he manipulated her, too. But the more she tried to protect Michael, the more she felt herself slipping into a dangerous web of deceit and lies. The more Elizabeth focused on defending Michael, the more she realized she was placing herself in the path of destruction. By helping him, by trying to control the narrative around his mental state, she was playing a game that could end in devastation. Drew's manipulation had already put her in a compromised position. And as she worked to shield Michael from the fallout, she was unknowingly stepping deeper into his trap. The adjustments she had made, her willingness to bend her morals for the sake of protecting Michael, were slowly eroding her foundation. She had always been someone who believed in the power of truth. But now, as she worked to protect Michael, she found herself lying, covering up, and making decisions that could destroy everything she had built. The more she fought to keep him safe, the more she felt herself becoming someone she didn't recognize, someone willing to compromise her own integrity. The danger she was placing herself in wasn't just external, it was internal, too. Elizabeth had always believed in doing the right thing, in making choices that would allow her to live with herself at the end of the day. But the new obsession with protecting Michael was threatening to undo everything she had worked for. She was losing herself in the process. The more she became entangled in Drew's web, the harder it became to see a way out. Every decision she made to protect Michael only seemed to pull her further into the dangerous game Drew was orchestrating. She was starting to lose sight of the woman she had always been, the woman who knew where the line was and refused to cross it. Now, she wasn't so sure anymore. In her quest to protect Michael, Elizabeth was allowing herself to be drawn into a fight she wasn't sure she could win. Drew had already proven how dangerous he could be. How far he would go to manipulate and control those around him. And now, Elizabeth was putting herself directly in his line of fire. By choosing to protect Michael at any cost. She was no longer just defending him, she was putting herself in the crosshairs of a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Elizabeth was walking a tightrope. And with every step she took, the danger grew. She was risking everything, her career, her reputation, and most importantly, her own sense of self. But despite the looming danger, she couldn't stop. She couldn't let Michael fall victim to Drew's schemes. Elizabeth had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to make the tough decisions. But now she was facing a situation that was beyond her control. The more she fought to protect Michael, the more she realized how deep she had become entangled in a web of manipulation, deceit, and danger. She was no longer just fighting for Michael's future, she was fighting to save herself from being consumed by the very forces she had hoped to protect him from. The danger wasn't just about Drew, it was about her own inability to let go, her inability to step away from a fight that was already consuming her. She was putting herself in the very position she had worked so hard to avoid, the position of someone who had lost control, who was at the mercy of someone else's manipulations. As the obsession to protect Michael intensified, Elizabeth knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. And she was no longer sure if the decisions she was making would lead to salvation or to her downfall. Each choice she made was taking her closer to a point of no return. And the consequences of her actions were starting to feel more like a ticking time bomb. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She couldn't keep ignoring the fact that, in trying to save Michael, she was putting herself in the most dangerous position of all. And as the walls closed in around her, Elizabeth realized that her obsession to protect Michael had already begun to cost her more than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just defending him, she was defending a version of herself that was slowly slipping away.